had the great pleasure of spending some time with the work of each of these people, some over many, many years and some over just a few days or hours. So I made a tiny poem out of some words that they wrote, channeled, who knows how we get our words. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this tiny poem, and then I'm going to read the bio of the person who is about to present, who is Sawako Nakayasu. Then Sawako will present, and then we'll go down the line this way, and I'll read each person's bio before they present. Sawako Nakayasu says, "A matter of boats, not having the angle, love against love. Diplomacy traps securities. Hours blow over, my wound of strange return." John Cayley says, "The activities associated with language, writing, and reading in grammatological terms are human activities that help to define us in the most fundamental sense as what we are, collectively and individually." Sophie Seita says, "Thinking about lines now, thinking about lines now, thinking about lines now, thinking about lions now, thinking about lie-ins now." Sophie Collins says, "Everyone has a future, but some have more than others." Sawako Nakayasu is going to give a talk called Power to the Edges, Notes on Translation. She is an artist working with language, performance, and translation, separately and in various combinations. She has lived mostly in the US and Japan, briefly in France and China, and translates from Japanese. Her books include Pink Waves, forthcoming from Omnidon, Some Girls Walk Into the Country They Are From, forthcoming from Wave Books, The Ants from Les Figues Press, Texture Notes, Letter Machine editions, and the translation of the collected poems of Chika Sagawa, Canarium Books, as well as Mouth Eats Color, Sagawa Chika translations, anti-translations, and originals. Reprint forthcoming from Wave Books. Yay! A multilingual work of both original and translated poetry. With Eric Sellen, she is co-editor of an anthology of 20th century Japanese poetry forthcoming from New Directions. She teaches here at Brown University, and you can find more information on her website.
I'm going to speak from here. Thanks. I just want to give a big thanks to Jane, thank you, to my co-organizers for this event. It's been tremendously gratifying to be here and share this space, and also really wonderful to see some of my former students. And I have to say, I've been having the special experience of revisiting works that we worked on together in class. So it's a process, and it's good to keep moving through it. I am going to start today by sharing the work of one of my favorite translators. Her name is Gabrielle Seville, and she's a performance artist. This is her book called Swallow the Fish. I would also recommend, if you're sitting somewhere where you can't read the screen, there will be some things on the screen that I will not read, so if it's not in your line of vision, I recommend that you move. This is an example of her work. Were you able to read it? Here's one more. You may have recognized these descriptions of iconic works of performance and visual art. I consider this series by Seville to be both performance and translation. The performance takes place inside the theater of the mind, invoking the memory of an image of a human body in a state of performance. The image of the figure is replaced in Seville's translation. Our response to these translations, as performed in our minds, forces a reckoning of the differences between what we assume, anticipate, and associate with one kind of body as opposed to another. This translation is both effective and interesting, not because it is equivalent, and nor because it is altogether different from the original, Rather, it is minimally different in a key strategic way. Even within conventional modes of literary translation, there are important choices to be made with regards to what kind of equivalence to prioritize. In his discussion about translating the poems of John Ashbery, English to Spanish translator Daniel Aguirre Oteiza describes how he manages the fact that Ashbery works in an idiolect all his own. He asks Ashbery himself about the meaning of a phrase and gets an unsatisfactory reply. Ashbery says, he goes on to consider Ashbery's idiolectic poetics, which he also describes as a poetry that, quote, aims at democratizing all forms of expression. Combining the root idio, proper to one, and idiot, meaning common man, Aguirre Oteiza determines that the task of translating the idiolectical poetry of Ashbery is a task not for the translator, but in fact for the idiotranslator, or idiot translator. And I might add, perhaps this also calls for an ignorant translator, a cousin of Jacques Rancière's ignorant schoolmaster. What the ignorant schoolmaster and the ignorant translator have in common is that they both reject the authority of a certain hegemonic and conventionally approved kind of master or mastery. And thus it begs the question, what then is the task of the emancipated translator? Next, I'd like to celebrate a manifesto for ultra-translation, written collaboratively by the language justice group Antena Aire, which you may have heard of if you were here today, and available as a free PDF download from their website. So here are a few lines from it. Ultra, spatially beyond, on the other side, indicating elsewhere. Ultra, going beyond, surpassing, transcending the limits. Ultra, an excessive or extreme degree. We want ultra-translation, to untranslate the seams, to extra-translate the gaps, to multi-translate the leaps, to infra-translate the porosities. We want the transfer and the untransferable both. Ultra-translation, like Gabriel Seville, refuses, removes, or repositions the notion of equivalence as the main guiding force in the human activity we call translation. The manifesto brings to light all that is made invisible in conventional translation. It's like talking about money among the bourgeoisie. You're not supposed to do it because it makes the false premise of equality fall apart. Ultra-translation is not polite. If a translation has made you discomfortable in their parlance, that may be why. By these measures, Gabriel Seville might qualify as an emancipated ultra-idio translator. You might want to look at the screen because there's stuff that I'm not saying. Sorry, it's uncomfortable if it is. However, for as good as it might sound to break free from the shackles of equivalence, the idea that a translation should aim to be equivalent to its source feels entirely natural, or standardized, as Douglas Robinson would call it. I think it's as natural as classical ballet. In his manifesto, What Kind of Translation is Literary?, Douglas Robinson launches an all-out attack on literary translation as it is commonly understood. He identifies two conventional assumptions about the translation of literature. One, that the target text is the same kind of literature as the source text. And two, this is quoting him, that the translated literary text is by default a bit inferior to its original. As Platonic copy theory has taught us for nearly 2.5 millennia, an imitation is inevitably worse than the thing it imitates. I would not disagree that this is the world we still live in. Robinson invents a derogatory acronym to make his point. SIDLT, which stands for Standard inferiorizing definition of literary translation. As harsh as it sounds, I believe this actually comes from a place of tremendous respect for translation and translators. The last line of the abstract of this paper suggests that literature, to quote, might be reimagined in terms of its transformative energies, and that translation might come to be seen as one of literature's most definitive genres. It was so exciting, I wanted to underline it. In other words, this curmudgeon-y stance arises from a great love for translation and faith in its potential. He claims that the acceptance or standardization of this inferiorizing stance is used, actually, to justify the very existence of these inferior products, or that the construct actually conditions translators to acknowledge defeat before even beginning. His is a call to shift the paradigm. Robinson would prefer to imagine the literary translator as one who seeks to create not just an inferior imitation of a great text, but a great imitative text that is qualitatively different from its model. He fleshes out an argument that is based on the history of the modern novel. He also points to examples like Ezra Pound's Cathay and Yoko Tawada's short story, which is translated into English as St. George and the Translator. This worldview blurs the lines between original texts and translated texts. About that, he writes, "There are original works that are presented as, and may be mistaken for, translations, and there are translations that are so brilliant that they are mistaken for or recategorized as originals. In practice, though, the predominance and cultural attachment to the Seedalt, as he calls it, forecloses on the true possibilities for excellent translations of this nature." What I share with Robinson is the belief that the literary translator is a genuine, bona fide artist. The resulting product is not an inherently inferior text, anxiously piggybacking on the cultural capital of some great original masterpiece. Better to run barefoot on a rhizomic expanse of grass. Better to free our bedraggled translator from the gated community of inferiority. Emancipation is not about pushing the boundaries out to become more inclusive. Emancipatory, ultra-ideo-no-dolt translation does not push the edges out. It is the edges. So, welcome to Sawako Nakayasu's Ultralight Ideo Beam School of Translation Emancipation. I arrive here under the influence of queer theory, and also under the influence of an interdisciplinary art practice. So, here are some examples of translating under the influence of art. The James Turrell Quaker Meeting School of Translation. If we had more time, we would actually do it. Here's Sophie Cowell's Voyeuristic Accumulation School of Translation. Butch Morris, Structured Improvisation School of Translation. I feel like I've already done this somewhere in my work. This one is nice too. Pauline Olivero's Sonic Meditation School of Translation. This is quoting from her text, "Translation is a welcome byproduct of this activity." Well, in hers it says music. Tetching Shea Durational Performance School of Translation. That's something I've really enjoyed. Hito Sterol's In Defense of the Poor Translation School of Translation. Low res, resurrected, pirated, imperfect translation, now. What's next? Adam Pendleton, Black Dada School of Translation. Oh, I misspelled it. Appropriation. Sorry. Christine Sun Kim's Redistribution of the Senses School of Translation. If you're interested in that concept, there's a beautiful essay that Michael Davidson wrote about Christine Sun Kim's work. Jose Munoz's Wildness of the Punk Rock Commons School of Anti-Translation. This is a quote from that paper, which was published posthumously. I prefer to think about it as an anti-genre, not as an anti-genre in that it refuses genre, but more like it's a genre of refusal. And now we are here at my Queer Liberation School of Translation. So, queer and transgender theory have made a tremendous contribution to the field of translation. Did you know that? By normalizing the term non-binary. The legacy of German philosopher Friedrich Schleiermacher lives strong, as my students know. But it is not too late to free ourselves from the gated community of binary thinking. It's relentlessly binary, our field. But fortunately for us, here comes the Countersexual Manifesto by Paul B. Preciado. The Countersexual Manifesto is a place where he moves the metrics of sexuality beyond bodies, beyond hetero-homosexual categories, and into the realm of the dildo. He writes, "Dildo tectonics is the counter-science that studies the appearance, formation, and utilization of the dildo. It localizes the deformations that the dildo inflicts upon the sex-gender system. It is also possible to generalize the notion of the dildo in order to reinterpret the history of philosophy and artistic production and translation practice. In this way, he applies pressure to the whole notion of what is natural. Sexualities are like languages. They are complex systems of communication and reproduction of life. As languages, sexualities are historical constructs with common genealogies and biocultural inscriptions. Like languages, sexualities can be learned. Multiple languages can be spoken. As is often the case within monolingualism, one sexuality is imposed on us in childhood, and it takes on the character of a naturalized desire." Now, let me rephrase this to accommodate our translation topic. Multiple modes of translation can be possible. As is often the case within monolingualism, one mode of translation is imposed on us in childhood, and it takes on the character of a naturalized desire. If a naturalized desire can be discussed in terms of sexuality and also of language, then my desire here is to denaturalize our learned conventions about translation. Even if you never actually quit the classical ballet school of translation, it is still exciting to know the possibilities, such as the Paul B. Preciado Dildo Tectonic School of Translation, at which point I also refer you to Erica Hunt, who considers poetry as a practice and a rehearsal for the actual life we want to live in. And I say that goes for translation also. So the last thing I want to leave you with is the subway train car of translation binaries. Over here is source text, over here is target text. They're represented by two man-spreaders on the train. There's a narrow space between them. When I get on that train, that is the moment when I bust out my Asian girl privilege. And I just plain sit my ass down in that in-between space, that non-space between two man-spreading endpoints, which means that I sit on them, so they move. And then it turns out there was a seat there in the middle after all. Thank you.
No, mine's long too.
Our next presenter is John Cayley, whose talk is titled Translating Process Over Horizons of Language. As many of you likely know, Cayley is the chair of literary arts at Brown. He has practiced as a poet, translator, publisher, and book dealer, and all these activities have been influenced by his training in Chinese language and culture. A number of Cayley's works of digital language art have addressed translation directly, not least a work titled Translation, 2004 onward, which was included last year in the exhibition Babel, Adventures in Translation at Oxford University. Cayley's Mirroring Events at the Sense Horizon, Translation Over Time, is included as a chapter in the recent collection Prismatic Translation. Cayley has recently published a number of essays on the experimental translation of born digital language art, beginning with the image in How It Is When Translating Certain Processes of Digital Language Art and The Translation of Process, which was also collected in At Translation's Edge. Details of Cayley's internationally recognized language art in networked and programmable media may be found on his website.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much to the organizers and to Jane and Sawako in particular. Also to Kusai, who I don't know but as yet, but I'm great. It's been great to be introduced to all this work and to people I haven't heard from before. So I'm standing because I'm going to be activating a video at some stage, and I just have to press the space bar, so I might as well stand up. I'm going to talk in relation to one of those essays, or a couple of those essays. And I'm not going to read. I'm going to read from a paper at one point, and I'm going to talk about its theory. I've been asked to talk about translation. I used to do translation. I still do translation. I find it highly problematic. I find talking about it highly problematic. I started to be asked, because I do this work with born digital work. How do you translate that? Everybody's fascinated by that problem. I'm not sure how fascinated I am. But one of the things that happens is that one of the things I've become concerned with over time is, what is the medium I'm working in? Now, like I should know that by now, right? I'm ostensibly a writer, yeah? But what is this medium that I work in? Language. What is language? Well, there are problems there. Like the linguists don't even know what language is. What the object of linguistics is a serious problem. And so these days I pretend to be interested in that problem, like in a relatively serious way, as I hope you'll see. It's going to be based on a paper or a chapter that's already been cited. I'm shamelessly plugging somebody else's book, Matthew Reynolds, who's a very interesting translation theorist who runs a thing in Oxford University called the Oxford Comparative Criticism and Translation Center. And it's published in a series. It's well worth checking out what they do. So I'm happy to advertise this book, which is UK published and not too easy to get over here, and quite expensive. And then there's another essay I did called Translation of Process, which has come out as a chapter and also online at an interesting online journal called Modern. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the translation of process, because that's what somebody like me always gets asked about. In other words, I make artifacts ostensibly literary. I call them language art artifacts, because calling them literary is a problem, as again I hope you will see, because literature is a problem. Our being focused or over-determined by working within the literary is a problem, and it's part of the problem of translation. So I thought about things that I do, and types of things I do, and I thought about what you would have to do to translate them, and which aspects, which rubrics would be addressed and problematized by trying to translate a work that is maybe written in language but time-based, or involves some procedure applied to the language that transforms it or deforms it, and then a corresponding procedure will have to be applied in the host language. I use guest host because it's much nicer than the other one, from Lydia Leo. So what does that mean? Like, how are they going to? How is the translator going to do that process? How are they going to handle it? You can also think of translation as itself a process, right? So it is obviously clearly some sort of literal and cultural process. You proceed, and you do there's a list of steps, like following a program. And what do you encounter immediately? You encounter problems of integrity. Now, the first two rubrics, integrity and association, are from copyright law. They are the moral rights, not always instituted in law, but nonetheless, they're the important ones. They're the ones that you as a creator care about. Is the integrity of your work going to be respected in the future? will people do something with it that you don't want them to do? Okay? Translation is an affront to integrity, clearly. It produces a double of the work in another language community, and then everybody's worried about whose it is, right? And is the work still as it should be? Integrity. Then association, there's another name involved, another proper name. Apparently an artist. Apparently these translators are creative. Like, okay, so who gets to have that association with the work, whatever it is, right? So you see how this plays out. And then the next one is conceptualism. Conceptualism I'm bringing in because works, even when they're not conceptual, often have a concept, right? And that concept will transform and deform the work. Sometimes, and these days we've got conceptual literature where there's nothing else but the concept, right? And you don't even have to read it because all you have to do is understand the concept and then you're done. You think about it. And so what happens there? Do you translate the text or do you translate the concept or you try and do both? You see, it's a problem. It's a problem with when that process is involved. Then there's explicit process. And this is where, like I write a program that generates a text, then I expect the translator to write a program that generates a text in the host language. And they should get with the program and do that. Do they? Not necessarily, as we'll see. And then, so those are the things that sort of frame procedure and make procedure or process. I think I worried about whether I'd chosen the wrong noun, process or procedure. Not worrying anymore because process is more active. It's more to do with something that is happening over time, whereas procedure is a little bit more stunned in terms of being a list of what you will or might do. Anyway, so then you come to the aspects of process or procedure that induce dissonance, what I call dissonance. And now I'm calling it grapholectic dissonance. Now, I'm going to explain that in a minute. So you can have procedurally induced local grapholectic dissonance. That's when you have a grammatical problem, right? You have to translate a text, and the grammar of the host language is different, those differences are implicated, and you will not be able to do the pronouns correctly because there's not the same set of pronouns, or pronouns are used in a different way, right? You will produce a text that does not correspond at the level of the grapholect in some sort of ideal notion of the grapholect, right? You'll have a problem, and that problem will not go away. The next one is a little bit harder, might be a little bit harder to understand, but is really sort of become pertinent now, and that's procedurally induced global grapholectic dissonance. That's to do with the relative status of the languages. So for instance, if you're applying, like say your process of translation involves at some stage doing machine translation as a first draft, say. Don't admit to it, but say you just do that, right? If you're translating from English into French, yeah, the data sets are big, right? But if you're translating from from Hungarian or from a little-known Asian language or whatnot, then the data sets are radically different. The reasons for the differences between your texts are different because of the relationships of the languages globally to the reference of resources available. And because they're now available to all of us instantly, that becomes more significant as a fact of translation. How am I doing for time?
You have 6 minutes left.
Okay. And then the final one is just natural linguistic non-correspondence or divergence, right? From whatever source. The fact that the texts on the grapholectic level will not correspond. And that is nearly always the case, right? Everybody can do the translation differently. And in a minute, I'm going to whiz through some examples. So, and they're not going to be technical. Well, the first is going to be a technical example. Then it's going to be actual poetry. sort of. Now, grapholectic. Grapholectic is what Walter Ong called the literary register, or whatever, right? So it's not hard for any of us in this room to agree that written literary language is a grapholect of English, right? But the implications of that are discounted, are put to one side, because this grapholect has immense authority, right? It's where we look to translation occurring. It occurs within the grapholect. But if you think about it, the analogy is language dialect, language grapholect, okay? And what do we normally think of dialects? We think of them as subaltern, right? But here it's language grapholect authority, right? And we're in the realm of certain sort of aspects of theory which are highly implicated and have a politics. So you know, if there's one takeaway to this talk, it's that the focus on the grapholect as it were the site and the framing of translation is a profound linguistic, philosophical, language philosophical, profound misdirection, which has to be resisted. And it's resisted, as we've heard, normally in the context of sort of interactions between language that occur where the subaltern is why you're doing it, right? For whatever reasons, because a particular literature is disregarded or because people are being treated badly. Okay, so this is an example of the sort of thing I do, and you can imagine what this means. So the tongue gets clogged with mud. This is a direct quotation from a part of Samuel Beckett's How It Is. Then this gets translated into, gets deformed into a text which the tongue gets clogged, maybe burned, told you it was hot. That comes from the internet, according to, with a sort of algorithmic process that generates the language. So you have a longer piece of text that contains its seed text, and this is partly algorithmic, partly composed. I partly compose it. So what if you want to translate it into French? Well, thankfully, Beckett already did that for his bit, right? So at least I don't have to worry about how to translate the English that I'm working with. So that's Beckett's translation of How It Is. Or I think he wrote How It Is first in French and then translated it into English. So that's even worse. And then I do the same process, but in French. So there's the process has been respected, but the correspondence, there's no natural linguistic correspondence between the texts. So I call that a translation, because it's a type of translation. It's a good translation, much better than if I translated the tongue gets clogged, maybe burned. And it's much more interesting as well. I'm not going to dwell on that. They're just shown parallel. Oh gosh. Okay. Well, so now you've got La Disparition. Then you've got translations of Cage into French. You've got an Italian example where a combinatorial novel was translated first in one of its instances, but there are millions and millions and millions, but they weren't all translated. And finally, Lisa Robertson, who has a book, Cinema of the Present, translated into French with her cooperation, and it's alphabetized. So it has to be so the lines are written once, and then they're alphabetized, and then they're interlaced. So certain key words like you, for a start, are you going to do vous or tu? And where are you going to put it? In the alphabetical order. And doesn't that change the book? So what do you do? And then this is what I want to show you. I hope there is time. If I can get it to play, let's hope it. Will the sound be up?
四是四，四是四，十是十，十是十，四十是四十是四十，四十十四十四。
Oh, sorry. I meant it to stop. I'll go back to there. So on the right, you've got the learner. On the left, you have, your left, you've got the teacher. And the teacher is giving a tongue twister in Mandarin Chinese. And Nicholas Procopi, the artist, is trying to learn it. And I'm going to try and very quickly, because I have no time, say here, is that this is not an analogy for translation, but a linguistic artifact is being taken back and forth across a horizon. And the thing that I want you to grasp from that is that what happens is that you can watch this, and it's linguistic, and he gets it right at a certain point, and then it's over, right? He can reproduce it. He doesn't know what it means yet, but he can reproduce it in a way which the teacher finds convincing and satisfactory. So something has been grasped, and something has gone over a horizon. In the meantime, we watch a lot of back and forth, and a lot of it is kind of amusing, especially if you know the language, right? Because there's a lot of little mistakes being made. But the point is that the horizon is always absolute. And you can, there's always there's a sort of absolute judgment that is made by one or other party as to whether where the artifact is. Is it on this side or is it on this side? Or is it nonsense still or is it not? And it's that, and so you can see in an active translation, there's no overarching reference point, but there's absolute understanding that something is grasped and agreed. And that it can move on either side of the border, either side of the horizon of the language. And that's what I think translation is about. So it's not about the actual forms on one or another side. It's just about on being able to read that artifact on either side of a horizon of language. So that's what it's all about. And it's very interesting because the thing that's being passed over and across doesn't have to have obvious semantic aboutness. Doesn't have to have that, but it has to be convincingly readable by persons on either side of the horizon. And if you just play, I'm sorry to take a little more time, if you play with that idea in relation to what you do when you translate, how you grasp it, can you make someone else read it in the other side of the horizon? It gives you a lot of leeway, which allows you to deform, follow different schools of translation, or to introduce processes, or to recognize and respect processes on the guest that you're trying to bring to the host. You can respect those processes without doing a bad job and doing something which is readable.
Thanks. Sophie Collins is going to present he's going to do a presentation called Currently and Emotion, Fidelity and Intimacy, Challenging Essentialism in Literary Translation. Sophie Collins grew up in Bergen, North Holland, and now lives in Glasgow. She is the author of the poetry collection Who is Mary Sue? From Faber 2018, winner of the Michael Murphy Memorial Poetry Prize and an Eric Gregory Award, and of Small White Monkeys, Bookworks 2017, a creative nonfiction text on self-expression, self-help, and shame. She is editor of Currently and Emotion, Test Center 2016, an anthology of contemporary poetry translations. A sequel, Intimacy, is forthcoming in 2020. Her translation from the Dutch of Leike Marsman, The Following Scan Will Last 5 Minutes, came out from Pavilion in 2019 and was published, and it was named a Poetry Book Society Choice. She is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and a lecturer at the University of Glasgow.
Hi. Just want to say, first of all, thank you so much to everyone at Brown for bringing me here all the way from the UK. I've been delighted and fascinated throughout the day to hear everyone speak, especially the students earlier. So this was initially going to be more of an academic talk, but I've decided to shift things slightly so I can do a bit of a reading from recent translation work. And I just... I'll be sort of talking about the various ways that I'm trying to intervene when it comes to dominant perceptions of literary translation in the UK, and I would guess these kind of resemble those that pervade in the US as well. And I'm speaking to you as I guess, primarily a poet, but also a lecturer, translator, editor, critic, roughly in that order. So someone who is thinking about this from various angles. So not only about what I can do as a translator in terms of who and what I translate, but also how, as a literary voice, I might be able to slightly shift the discourse on translation. So I'll start by talking a bit about editorial projects and critical work, and then do the reading from the translation. Hopefully in that way joining theory with practice. So the reason that I think I'm here today, and that I know both Sawako and Sophie, other Sophie, is via this book, currently in Emotion, Translations. It's an anthology of contemporary poetry translations, and something that I put together over a couple of years and that was published in late 2016. And for me, it was really about trying to challenge the dominant, again, contemporary poetry anthology form and format. So presenting extended excerpts from book-length translations rather than sort of one-off translations of individual poems, including extended notes written by myself on the processes involved, and also avoiding that thing of presenting translations from a small handful of Western European countries. So the title contains two metonyms, currently pointing towards our current cultural political moment, though a lot has changed even since the book was published 4 years ago, and then emotion, so indicating our current preoccupations with subjectivity, identity, truth, and affect. Affect increasingly interesting for me in relation to translation. So in my introduction to the book, I discuss a number of issues facing translation, namely, and these have come up again and again throughout the conference, the perception of translation as a neutral process, a sort of word-for-word exchange, and then the connected issues that this raises in terms of our understanding of who and what gets translated. So I go on to speak about the ways in which making translation and translators visible, in emphasizing process over product, in emphasizing choice, is just one of the ways to attempt to affect a longer-term change in terms of perceptions of translation. Because if we acknowledge the subjectivity of the translator, we're also acknowledging the broader channels through which translations reach us. Another thing that I tried to do in the book is to embrace Maria Timoczko's, I will not be pronouncing that correctly, understanding of translation as an open category. So offering translations, to use Roman Jakobson's terms, that are not only interlingual, but intralingual and intersemiotic, because I think that even to a reader unfamiliar with translation theory, there's something about broadening translation that actually reinforces an understanding of it rather than diluting it. But over the past year or so, I think in my research, my interest has shifted back to interlingual translation, because I still think this is the locus for the challenges that we face regarding perceptions of translation. So what I'm going to offer now are sort of notes towards a new anthology project that was just mentioned, a sequel to Currently in Emotion that's titled Intimacy, and I'm going to do so by reading directly from this broadside. I have a few copies of these, if anyone's particularly interested. There are about 5 copies there, which I can offer for free. And they fold up into this sort of pleasing pamphlet shape, or you can leave them more like a sort of poster situation. And on one side there are the notes that I'm making towards the anthology, and then on the other a series of quotations, people who I'm reading at the moment who are really helping direct the work in there. So Gayatri Spivak, Lisa Robertson, Domi Che, Lauren Ballant, among others. I think also, of course, Lawrence Venuti is a big influence for me, and Kwame Anthony Appiah. So I'll just do a short reading from this, and then I'll go straight into the translation from the Dutch. Collectively, the texts in Currently in Emotion expressed a dictum, namely that translation exists where the terms of translation apply. But whose terms are we talking about here? What language? Translation is a mode of writing and a performance of interpretation. Translation is reading, is listening and speaking, assent and argument, only it is rarely thought of as such. Fidelity. Understandings of translation and the translator-author relationship have for years been governed by a steadfast conceptual barrier, fidelity. At its heart, fidelity is a term founded on the values of our racist, patriarchal social system. This is manifest in the many adages pertaining to translation which continue to propagate, not only in broadsheet reviews in mainstream media, but in literary organizations and universities. Perhaps the most infamous of these is that known as Les Belles Infidèles, which, coined in the 17th century by classicist Roger Zuber, attests that translations, like women, can be either beautiful or faithful, but not both. The reasons for deconstructing and refiguring fidelity on its cultural associations alone are many. What have often been overlooked, however, are the ways in which the current model fails to uphold its own promise as a method of interpretation founded on comparative analysis. Critiques of translations that apply the terms fidelity or faithfulness do not tend to compare the translation directly to the source text, but rather to a particular reading or understanding of that source text determined by the critic's knowledge or assumptions. This means that a translation can be judged negatively by a critic or reviewer when it doesn't match their own interpretation of the source poem, when it is often presented as, and very much thought by the critic to be, universal or definitive. As a system of enforcement, fidelity leans strongly on shame as a regulating factor, though the connection is often largely implicit, very quiet. Rather than marriage, the process of translating is surely closer to the cloying, liberating space of friendship, where positive and negative are generally understood to be part of the same trajectory, where a physical and or intellectual proximity to another often results in coinages, portmanteaus, that is, in the development of a unique language, where the basis of quality is determined by the two or more people directly involved, given that there is no presiding model as such, no authority, where a translator and author work together to create a new text, a shared voice. Two qualities of the intimate translation: heightened contextualization and challenge to dominant linguistic values in the receiving culture. And there's more to say on both of those, but to leave time for the reading, I'll go straight on. So I'm going to be reading from this book, The Following Scan Will Last 5 Minutes, which is a translation of a contemporary Dutch poet, Lieke Marsman, who's a friend of mine and who was diagnosed with cancer about 2 years ago. She's my age, actually a year younger. And I'll read, I think, 3 poems and then a little bit from my commentary to this book, which is super long. It's about 10 pages, which in the context of a very short book feels like I'm taking massive liberties, but I guess that's the point. And it takes the form of a series of letters to Lieke, picking up on those ideas of shame that I just mentioned. I think for the translations, you don't really need to know much. There's Dutch place names and brand names, which I don't feel like explaining, apart from maybe praxis, which is, because it could get understood as praxis, which is not. It's like the Dutch B&Q, which I don't have an American reference for, like a DIY store. What is it? Home Depot. There we go. Yeah. Learn something every day. Okay. The following scan will last 4 minutes. Before you sink away into the morphine-sweet unreality of the everyday, we would like to say something about those spasms and fasciculations of yours, as well as that bump on your back. For years, you have no doubt been Googling every freckle. Just recently, you were at the doctor's with a patch of dry skin on your leg, diagnosis, too much shower gel. But on hearing the word chondrosarcoma, you went home and immediately unplugged your router. Do you know where your priorities lie? Do you know what life has to offer? Or did those endless therapy sessions and that 8-week mindfulness course simply teach you how to tolerate suffering, that every signal in your body can be temporarily expelled to the rhythm of some breathing exercise? Let the pain be. To be free is to be free of need. wrong. To be free is to need some fresh air and to be able to get up and go outside. Don't say we didn't warn you. The following scan will last 2 minutes. It is 1952. Bright colours exist only in nature, do not yet fill the aisles of Xenos. You can add an egg to the cake mix to make yourself feel like a good housewife. Somewhere on the outskirts of Twente, my great-grandfather is dying of bladder cancer. It is 2018. You can separate glass from paper to make yourself feel like a good citizen. You use a linen shopping bag. You give readings about the environment. You travel off-peak using a discount. You no longer have the strength to collect the small change you get for recycling bottles at the supermarket. You just throw them all in the general waste. The following scan will last less than a minute. Afternoons are Eurosport replays of alpine skiing, sponsored by Jack Wolfskin and Milka, brands to whom I am grateful for facilitating this daily moment of calm. Evenings are the joy I take in loving Simone as much as I do, especially in the face of this overwhelming exhaustion. Cancer is so quotidian. You hear about it on Wednesday morning, die on a Tuesday afternoon, no strobe lights, no cloakroom check-in, the sun is shining, a completely ordinary, insipid sun above the A10 and the exit for Praxis. Dear Lika, the last time I saw you, we began the evening in Café de Jaren on Nieuwe Doelenstraat, Amsterdam, a spacious canal-side bar frequented by arty types and students from the nearby university buildings. We were talking intently. A man walked up to our table and pointed a finger at the book I'd just given you. It was a copy of my own then recent poetry collection. You picked up the book and began selling it to the interloper in the style of a telemarketer or door-to-door salesperson, which was at once dismissive and eminently charming. And as I watched you perform for me and the stranger, I thought consciously of how much I like you. The man, somewhat bewildered, soon left us alone again, at which point, wanting a cigarette to follow the wine I'd just finished, I asked if you were smoking. We'd smoked together before, and you said no because you had cancer, and I felt embarrassed, having not wanted to assume anything of the fact of your diagnosis. Later that evening, at a literary event where I had just read a piece on the subject of shame, you asked me if I felt that I was a particularly shameful person, which seemed to be a question concerning my capacity for feelings of shame, rather than an implied judgment, and I didn't quite know how to respond. Dear Lika, in some ways I have no shame. At other times I am overpowered by it. Translation is a bit like this. One moment you might feel entitled to, or at least in tune with the source material, while at other times you find yourself immobilized by the dreaded imposter syndrome that creeps in every time you attempt to engage with the other's work in the other's language. I related this feeling to some of my girlfriends who translate, and they nodded solemnly in concurrence. This common experience suggests that the work of translation is frequently inhibited by feelings of shame, and it got me thinking about translation's relationship to shame, about how the translation dynamic corresponds to or perhaps reinforces the mechanisms through which the shame affect functions. Dear Lika, as we both know, shame manifests when a person perceives a discrepancy between a projected standard of how they believe they should be or how they could have been, and how they see themselves as being in actuality. So in instances of shame, there's the real actual self plus two imagined selves, one who made the right decisions, who is endlessly humane to both herself and others, and another who is irrevocably flawed, scarred, with those flaws permanently on the verge of exposure. Similarly, translation is a three-way street, in the sense that the translation process always involves an author and her text, the source text, a translator and a translation. When we police translations by strenuously enforcing fidelity, we engineer shame in the translator by forcing her to measure her translation, which is an extension of herself, against an imagined or notional translation that is flawless, perfect in its equivalency. Judged in this way, the translator will almost definitely fail in her task, just as vulnerable humans fail when they measure themselves against imagined, idealized, and non-existent selves. Because equivalence between language simply doesn't exist in the way we would like to think it does. Theorists like Kwame Anthony Appiah have shown this time and time again. On the other hand, if we do away with fidelity, adopting instead some other kind of value system, the translator might be released from the pressure of a projected standard that is ultimately a shame-inducing illusion. Thank you.
And finally, Sophie Seita is going to present Translation as Pedagogy, a Manifesto for Reading. Sophie Seita works with text and sound on the page, in performances, lecture performances, videos, and through translation and multimedia collaborations. She recently had a solo exhibition at Space in London titled My Little Enlightenment Plays, and has performed and presented her work in London, New York, Santiago de Chile, Paris, Bristol, Cambridge, Berlin, Amsterdam, Darmstadt, Germany, Cork, Ireland, and elsewhere. She's the author most recently of My Little Enlightenment, a lecture performance from Other Forms in 2019, and Provisional Avant-Garde Little Magazines from Dada to Digital from Stanford University Press 2019. She's the translator of Uliana Wolf's Sub-Sisters Selected Poems 2017, for which she received a Penn Grant, and the editor of The Blind Man 2017, named one of the best art books of 2017 by the New York Times. She's published essays and reviews on performance art, feminist hospitality, digital publishing, translation, multilingualism, and experimental poetry. She is currently an assistant professor at Boston University, working on a book of lyric essays and a project on what she calls literary live art.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thanks so much to the organizers, and thanks to the other panelists. I have so many ideas and would love to immediately respond, but I'll have to hold back and present my piece first. Okay. To translate is to surpass the source. These are some words I put into the mouth of a character in My Little Enlightenment Plays, a performance project in which I rewrote, translated, responded to, and one could say corresponded with some Enlightenment thinkers and writers. Isn't translation always the putting of words into someone's mouth, that someone sometimes being you? Words can contextualize, embellish, explain. They can be raw, they can be tender, they can be violent, they can be matter of fact, or they can translate matter into something else. Words force us to be nuanced. While translation trades in words, it also encompasses for me the moving of material from one place to another, which is admittedly a broad delineation, but capaciousness can be a generosity. So, translation might mean moving a language, an idea, an image, a material like paper, Tipex, clay, to a known or unknown elsewhere, or it might mean transforming it into another form, genre, or medium. This talk, which is a kind of delirious reading in progress, will propose a sprawling and lounging understanding of translation. Translation as an inventive, generative, and often collaborative practice, translation as a form of writing as reading, and translational reading as a pedagogical tool. In Sarah Ahmed's terminology in her manifesto, Living a Feminist Life, translation is in my feminist killjoy survival kit. And so the three things I take to the desert island of obsessive exercise are nuts for nourishment, hummus for humility, and dragon fruit for keeping the eyes alight amidst the non-variation and promise of paradise, which is another thing I put into a play. When I translate, I keep everything in play or at bay. Sound play, in turn, like any good tutor, imparts knowledge by osmosis. Like a manifesto, I see translation as a deeply pedagogical form because it teaches you to read. So here's my manifesto for reading. Principle 1, no to verticality. Languages and art forms don't exist on a slope of significance. Principle 2, we will stop valorizing originals, which is an old hat in its critique but bears repeating. Principle 3, we will remain open to our own translation. Principle 4, we will view translation as a process for transformation. Principle 5, a translational pedagogy is a playful pedagogy. Principle 6, a playful pedagogy will be less predictable. We won't know where the ball will land or who, if anyone, will catch it. Principle 7, scratch the house style. These almost wise and not quite adamant demands serve a pragmatic truth, which is provisional and admits to not knowing. Not knowing, as Jack Halberstam argues in The Queer Art of Failure, may in fact offer more creative, more cooperative and surprising ways of being in the world. Translation, like a manifesto, like pedagogy, is of a delayed futurity. If this were a proper manifesto or a classroom, I would invoke a we, a call for action. What action is reading? Taking a shower is an activity. Taking a bath professes not doing. To write in the bath is to enter the jurisdiction of floating, of idleness. Lisa Robertson's she-dandy allows herself to pursue her thoughts languorously. What knowledge does leisure afford? What Virginia Woolf says about rereading novels also rings true for translations. Quote, "To rush it breathlessly through does very well for a beginning, but that is not the way to read finally." For Woolf, our reading habit has been formed by the drama, and the drama has always recognized the fact that human beings cannot sit for more than 5 hours at a stretch in front of a stage, unquote. This might have something to do with the attention economy, but also our scholarly desire to extract, to unearth. Is passing always in cahoots with parsimony? Avoid finality, etc. A non-extractive reading might be one that answers in kind, not by translation into a different discourse, but by using a creative circuitry of aesthetic kinship. Writing through reading can mean taking it in, chewing it, letting it percolate. I want a pedagogy of percolation. In my teaching, I promote what I call translational reading, which tries to understand a text by doing something with it. In a workshop called Reading with Material, I gave my students clay, string, paper, tape, felt fabric, plastic bags, and wire, and various other materials. I invited them to encounter their chosen material, spend time with it, ask questions about its properties. Touch is an invitation to explore and grasp, and therefore to know and understand. Here's Eve Sedgwick on texture in her book, Touching Feeling, quote, "To perceive texture is never only to ask or know what is it like, nor even just how does it impinge on me. Textural perception always explores two other questions as well. How did it get that way? And what could I do with it?" Unquote. Sedgwick could be giving us a gloss for translation here, and also of epic theatre. Brecht wanted an engaged audience, inviting an interest in function and use. What could what we see on stage, which is a translation of a kind of reality, be different? Here's the instruction I gave the students when I presented them with the materials, again via Sedgwick. Quote, "To touch is always already to reach out, to fondle, to heft, to tap, or to enfold, and always also to understand other people or natural forces as having effectively done so before oneself, if only in the making of the textured object." Impractically, that is unserviceably, this also leads us to ask, as Joyelle McSweeney asks, what regime does a work of art appeal to? Does the work of art appeal to a sensory, generic, or interpretive regime? I take this question as a pedagogical principle, a principle for reading. Again, what would that mean practically? To practice is to repeat an exercise. For McSweeney, quote, "Translation, the migrant of a very special nature, the filthiest medium alive." Lalu, the red wife, the hitchhiker in Banu Kapil's Incubation, A Space for Monsters, is the immigrant as monster. A monster is always itinerant. If, as Kapil writes, quote, "Sex is always monstrous," her speaker spits out, "I want to have sex with what I want to become." And if becoming is always becoming with, as Donna Haraway suggests, then we become monstrous in the act of translation. The monstrous is a deviant form. And if the monster is in some way deformed, it draws attention to form as constitutive of its being. Etymologically, the monster shows and warns. The translation as monster is our fear of derivation. An experimental translation, by contrast, derives a fair bit of pleasure from deviating from the norm. Irreverently non-literal, it only literalizes its own demand for diversion. It is demonstrative of a process of persistent rereading, which we could call a practice. Jack Halberstam, in writing about disciplines, states that, quote, "Being taken seriously means missing out on the chance to be frivolous, promiscuous, irrelevant." In critical writing, we cite to show our knowledge, our debts, to pay homage, to agree or disagree, to find lines of con or divergence. Translation is always a dialogue, so L. We illustrate, we dangle another voice off the end of our critical fishhook, which might be a distraction and an ethical conundrum. S. What if the hook were not for catching fish, but a cyborgian pirate prosthesis? The prosthesis is an extension of the body. My body is an extension of my body, Barbara Browning. That's kind of like a dumb myth of freedom, go make our own laws and control our own ship, Kathy Acker. L, which is the utopian dream? S, do we dream of the ability to think endlessly without ever reaching the point of exhaustion? L, exhaustion has its own internal rhythm. Anxiety is the carefully trodden path of my own pleasure. S, anxiety is a translational topos, that is, topology is the interrelationship and arrangement of constituent parts, the properties of an object that stay the same under the constant stretching, twisting, crumpling, and bending. L, is that what you mean by understanding a text by doing something with it? S, force yourself to think onto the page or go off it so you can be off, be beside the point. L, quote, crusting, pushing, shifting, sliding through itself, shearing away, something that huffs itself, form evaporating, changing, molding, unquote. S, if criticism is obsessed with quotation, a manifesto for reading ought to be a barrage. I don't want to bombard you. L, oh, please bombard me. How do we hold another's idea? Dearly, surely, so we can turn words into lozenges in our mouth. When my primary reader is you, my reading path leads to the you I address privately or the you I imagine in a sort of shadow play public. Maybe reading is always the private dance of the author under the intimate gaze of the reader. Or, as Rebecca Solnit writes in The Faraway Nearby, what is said to total strangers in the silence of writing is then recuperated and heard in the solitude of reading. No is the interjection of the manifesto. I accidentally typed injection. Interjections convey a sentiment. Grammatically, an interjection is unrelated to any other part of the sentence. You see, this is still a sort of manifesto for reading. Anne Boyer reminds me that the no of a poet is so often a yes in the carapace of a no. The no of a poet is sometimes but rarely a no to the poem, but more usually a no to all dismal aggregations and landscapes outside of the poem. When we say no, where does that negation lead us? No to style, says Yvonne Rainer. A style of negation is also a style. Style comes from stylus, which is a pen. Around 1700, choreography began to mean the act of notating a dance on paper. For me, a choreography of language is also about gesture, about motion and emotion, about direction and patterns, about legible and illegible shapes. For example, how Pina Bausch's dancers weave patterns into the leaves on the stage of her disturbing piece Bluebeard, crunching. The women literally go up the wall. The dance makes visible a metaphor, a physical translation, so they hang suspended like crushed insects dried on wallpaper. Is this taking the movement metaphor too far? No to moving or being moved, Yvonne Rainer again. Translation can be a no to being physically removed from the borders of identity or nationality. How many more metaphors for translation can we conjure up? Metaphors inflate at their own risk. I was told this when I made a promise I didn't quite keep. Ian Patterson asks us to, quote, think about what happens when I read a poem which is based in an act of translation which imagines text out of one existence and into another, even as it writes. Not so much translating a poem as translating the reading performance of a poem into the world of another poem. The source text here is more than a source and less than a text, or maybe the other way around, more than a text and less than a source, or maybe neither. Maybe just a resource or a resurgence or even an insurgence. At all events, it raises the question of what survives of the poem's sources and what has to be destroyed, both in the writing and the reading. We might suppose that any act of reading a poem harms it. Intentionally or unintentionally, we wound, disfigure, or deface the poem as we read it, because we hallucinate our sense of its sense. As Winnicott puts it in another context, the fact is that an external object has no being for you or me except insofar as you or I hallucinate it. But being sane, we take care not to hallucinate except where we know what to see. What would it mean to hallucinate the sense of the translated object? To hallucinate is to go astray in thought. Often when I teach, I do not know what will come out of my mouth. Teaching is the translation of reading into a room. Another kind of thinking out loud into a space with a direct address, into a temporary holding space for ideas. Both the avowed expert, the teacher, and the allegedly impressionable students perform the act of translation. They paraphrase a text into supposedly more palatable prose pieces. What makes a work, a language, palatable? To call what I do translational is to take the word ending as a simile. Something is like translation. It doesn't need to be it. Re is the prefix of translation. Repeat, return, reread. Re is about movement in time and space, intensification, iteration, memory, and futurity. In this realm of re, translation and writing as reading are in a constant mirror stage of recognition, of towardness and relationality. This can be joyous or judgmental. Sometimes breathing can feel heavy, the limbs might go numb. Could the tingling hands be a symptom of the itch to produce, all energy rushing to the life-sustaining organs? What is the tingling effect of translation, of reading? When something goes numb, it is also hypersensitive. Let's add a principle to this flailing manifesto. Principle 8, I'm willing to care, I'm willing to show it. So bodies exist, they make lateral choices, their innards shimmer, which is the task of the translator, to bring out the shimmer. For example, if you stretched that left arm or that right leg, you'd become unrecognizably body, or more prosaically, you'd fix an itch, adjust some muscular tension. And then we could all go for a good glass of sherry and say, there you go, now we know what this body, this language can do, what a lovely day. But then you discover a freckle and another and another and another, and in this unforeseen lockstep, you step into some generalizable theory of knowledge. Thank you.
Does any of you want to ask each other anything? Or ask the audience anything before we let the audience ask you anything?
Actually, yeah, I have a question for Sophie, thinking a bit more about intimacy, or like what the anthology, like how you're going to think about intimacy, or like the intimacy of maybe the translator to the text, or like what forms that might take. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's,
Yeah.
as I said, it's still something I'm working on, but basically it's going to be a much smaller pool of translations than was in Currently in Motion. There were 29 texts in that, and I think it's going to focus, to use, to sort of speak to what you're saying, much more on the way in which the source texts have been read by the translator.
Yeah.
And so there'll be extended commentaries and collaborative texts that sort of aim to expose that
That's
process,
cool, yeah.
I suppose. Yeah.
Sounds good. Yeah, sounds great.
I don't know where the mics are. Oh, there we go.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me without this? Oh, but we need this. I always do something. Hi. Thanks so much to all 5 of you. I have a question which is more of you mentioned queer theory, you mentioned Jack Hubberstam and Sedgwick, and I could not stop thinking Audre Lorde. And there is a phrase that my colleague Jack always tells the students, and he tells to all of us all the time, is you cannot dismantle a master's house with a master's tools. And a lot of the commentary was a sort of poem, sort of this, sort of that. Is there a language being created as a terminology individual to experimental translation that does not create a reaction to it, the type of Audre Lorde has advised for over 30 years ago? And she was talking about non-binary before the binary. She was talking about class and race and sexuality and fluidity long before others started talking about that. And an example of this that I like is, again, Jack's notion of an architecture, which is creating monsters and constructing things, but it takes it away from what we're used to in literary theory by creating a new sense of bodies, this monsters sort of idea of a body that's created in anarchy. So I guess this was the thought I had while you were giving your talks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's something I think about a lot, that it's very hard to write. I think it's great that we write in response to someone else or something else, but I think it's hard to just like reinvent the wheel, like as it were. Like I don't know if there is another language or if there needs to be a completely new language. But I think, I was just thinking about this, that this is also kind of the form of the manifesto. It always has to kind of construct this like opposition. There's this kind of oppositionality that's kind of built in. At the same time, there can also be something affirmative about it, or like, you know, the element of care, if we introduce the element of care or provisionality. So even though it might take issue with some, like, I don't know, a translational manifesto or pedagogy or experimental translational practice, it can still be maybe based on like a more provisional, not knowing, and kind of, I don't know if that makes sense, but I think I'm less worried about using the language. I think it's more about acknowledging maybe the problem or the complicities or the difficulties of working within that language. I think to completely step out of it. I don't know how I would do it, or if I would need to do it. Yeah, I don't know. How do you think about it?
Well, one response I had is, as I was listening to all of us and your comment too, is that the sense that none of this is new, and it's very, very present, and yet it still bears repeating, which is the problem.
Right.
And so it leaves me feeling complicated, as I feel excited and interested in the potential and opportunities that these avenues connect to multiple concerns that are very present today, and I feel them very presently. And what does it mean about us that we say this, and it's been said over and over again, and yet we keep having to return? And also just the sense that we've been saying these things on a panel that's specifically delineated as experimental translation. So in that way, there's a self-marginalization happening within the construct of the conference. So I'm aware of that.
I just wanted to bring in a quote. I know that wasn't directed at me, but it just made me think of something, which is, I reread Audre Lorde's essay and teach that essay every single year. And I think it's really worthwhile constellating that with as many other texts and ideas as we can that have to do with the dismantling of the master's house in every way. And so one that's been rolling around in my mind a lot lately is something that the poet Natalie Diaz wrote in an essay, which is, and I was actually thinking about this when John mentioned this morning, Black U.S. American work as hegemonic and as responsive to hegemony at the same time. So Natalie Diaz writes, "We work against English even when we are working in English. We know this tension well. We grow fruit in it. We make love in it."
I kind of want to say that these days I feel a little bit sort of like consciously as if I am using, very explicitly a language which is very conventional and very stylized to address things that I think are profoundly misdirected, as I tried to say, and I think that you can do that, and it was sort of wonderful to hear Sophie talking about writing as reading and reading performance, and in other words, reading, which for me is it's like I'm just thinking, if you just address yourself to reading, which is after all sort of foundational within what is done in the institution of the university, and you take it to the conclusions that you would draw if you think about reading, then you will very quickly get to a place where you're involved with performance and you're involved with theoretical ideas that are profoundly challenging to the whole notion, for instance, of literacy. Like, what is reading? If reading constitutes language, then what? Or constitutes translation, then what?
I also just want to add something. I also teach that essay to my students, and we always have this conversation. And I also have this conversation when I teach, avant-garde work, or when we discuss the avant-garde, and what the future is of the avant-garde, or like the avant-garde promises. And then, I usually say that you can believe in utopia and work towards it, or like work towards the revolution. But I think there's also a danger in like an absolutism. And I think that's also related to our critical modes of reading and a certain kind of scholarship, or the modes of critique that are applied. So I think that there could be something that is, I don't know, as I said, like more provisional, or that accepts that there's something like recycling, or like actually that's again like thinking about eco-criticism, or like ecological concerns that may be like humus or recycling, or like trash, going through that stuff, like reusing, fixing, mending. That can be the way before we get to that point of the completely new or other that we imagine and wish for. But and there's also like this, and the other thing I also always teach in conjunction with that is Merle Lederman Ukele's Maintenance Art Manifesto, and it's like, which is just so beautiful, thinking about maintenance, and who's going to pick up the rubbish after the revolution, and so
Do you hear William Anderson's response to that?
No.
I will send it to you.
Oh yeah,
after this
please, yeah,
panel.
yeah,
It's amazing.
yeah, that's amazing, yeah.
I'm going to actually interrupt and just be a super bossy moderator of the kind I actually am, and say that there's other hands, and invite
But we should continue the
Yeah.
conversation.
No, I'm just saying this is maybe not be the context. And if everyone goes all silent and there's nothing, I will call on you.
So I'm going to go out on a limb here. So this is a question addressed to John, but perhaps the whole panel. And perhaps influenced by Nicanor Parra, the physicist anti-poet, or poet anti-physicist, I was trying to understand your concept of horizon, and right. And so what came to mind as an analogy is this idea of the event horizon, the apparent horizon. And this is the question, really. We can read it both ways, as a sort of a gravitational collapse of language, translation and and communication, or as Stephen Hawking with the notion of apparent horizon, say it's the sign of an expanding universe. But I'm trying to understand what. Yeah, right.
It's not an absolute horizon like that. That's not the metaphor. In other words, that would be like an ultimate collapse of all information into whatever the black hole is. But the thing that I'm these days thinking about and working with is the way that language is a series of discrete entities. So there are that difference, as we all know if we've done any sort of philosophical thinking about language, it's about that space between whatever the entities are, and the way that space creates whatever it is that language is. I'm just going to do it with the natural language horizon. You can make a sort of liminal objects, but they're always basically sort of in a nonsense space, and then they suddenly change their form enough that they become suddenly over into on the other side, right? And I think that's the case with all language. That in other words, you have a something you want to say, and then you have to put it into a way that will allow it to be grasped. And then that grasping will be sudden in terms of the reading of that object once you've formed it well enough. So there's always this thing, I call it grammaleptic. I say that you put difference and différence and you throw them all out there, and eventually the form emerges, and then suddenly it's seized, right? And it takes form in a way which is readable to another. But that suddenness is very real, and so that's why you can talk about things like horizons, because incomprehensibility. If I don't know the language, it's nothing to me, in a way.
Thank you. Now I'm totally confused.
Sorry. Good. I've tried to write about it.
Are there other questions? Okay, I don't know the name of the brilliant human who had the Audre Lorde question, but back to you.
Okay.
Everyone's tired.
Yeah.
It's been a long day.
So, my understanding is that the next person who has something to say is Kusai, but I cannot lay my eyes on. Oh, there you are.
Where is he? Oh, there he is.
So before Kusai comes up here to do whatever he's going to do to wow us, can we please thank our brilliant final panel?
Yeah, I'll send it to you. Also, it's like a work in progress. I would love feedback, actually.
Thank you so much for this amazing panel. And at the conclusion of the conference, I want to thank all the participants for their valuable contributions, and also the audience for their thoughtful presence. Personally, I want to thank Sawako for being an amazing team player, and also Jane, who's been, where's Jane? Jane did wonderful and amazing, and she made the experience of organizing the conference not only tolerable, but actually enjoyable. I'm going to say a few words. I was asked to say a few words at the end of the conference that would tie in all the panels together. But I will be very brief because I know you all are tired, and also there is wine, so I don't want to stand between you and wine. When we decided to organize this conference, one purpose was rather simple and admittedly twofold. Designating a space that is common for the different humanities disciplines, and two, gathering scholars and practitioners of translation to reflect, comment on, and enhance this common glue that binds the different disciplines together. However, yesterday's and today's panels have proven that while translation is indeed a discipline that binds the humanities together, it also is the ultimate disruptor of these disciplines. At once, it allows these disciplines to function, literally, but it also is the critique that questions a number of givens often taken into granted. We've learned from John Keane, Madhu Kaza, Rajiv Mohabir, Kate Haydeen, Moira Angeleri, and Cole Swenson that investigating translation as process and product forces us to question bigger framing arguments and dominant narratives. Kate Goldman, Jen Hofer, and Stephanie van Riegersberg have shown us that the calamity, but also the promise of translation. Translation as destroyer and preserver, if you would, when a single mistake can decide a human being's fate. Zachary Singh, Nidia Schumacher, Stephanie Ravion, Zhujing Li, and the undergraduate showcase prove the relevance of translation to teaching, and Steen Ann, Chloe Hill, Kendall Morris, Baoli Yang have shown us that what a bright future lies ahead with these emerging translators. And finally, John Cayley, Sophie Collins, Sophie Seita, and Sawako Nakayasu wowed us with the endless yet purposive possibilities that the play of translation can bring. The different takes on the conceptual and the formalistic questions in this panel, in fact, reminds us of both the boldness and frailty of translation by celebrating the promise of language as the joy, not the prison house of thought. This sense of play is an excellent way to conclude the conference, a playful conclusion that reminds us of the cohesion and fragmentation of the humanities. But included in this play of explanation and disruption, of representing the original by ironically surpassing it, is a promise of a better, richer world, materially and intellectually facilitated by mediation, the core of what translation does. Thank you all and safe travels.